Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm Sandi, Safro, and I'll be your co-host for today's episode. I am joined in our virtual booth by my co-host, David Wochner. Hey, David.
Hey, Sandi.
Today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Middle East, North Africa region, or MENA. And we are really excited to be recording this podcast episode contemporaneous with the release of our newest chapter of the Hydrogen Handbook, which covers the MENA region. We are joined today by two of our colleagues from our Middle East offices who are going to help us talk through some of the opportunities and the challenges that the development of a hydrogen economy at scale in the MENA region may face. First, we're joined by Pawel Piotrowski, who is a partner in our Doha office and a member of our construction and infrastructure practice within our energy, infrastructure, and resources practice group. We are also joined by Sholto Hanvey, who is a senior associate in our Dubai office and also a member of the construction and infrastructure practice. And interestingly, Dubai is where GasTech 2021 will be hosted this September, and there will be a significant focus on hydrogen at that conference. Pawel and Sholto, welcome to the podcast. We are so excited to have you both with us today.
Thank you very much. We're very happy to be here.
Thank you, Sandi. Thank you, David.
Just to kick things off, when we talk about the Middle East and North Africa region with respect to hydrogen, which countries are we generally talking about? And do you think that we'll see these countries pursue hydrogen on an individual basis, or do you think that there's the potential for these countries to work together?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sandi. So in the Middle East, North Africa region, there are only a handful of countries that have both the resources and decide to pursue hydrogen projects at the moment. And the states that are leading this charge and investing in hydrogen research programs and pilot schemes are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, and Egypt. Qatar, where I'm based, is yet to set out its own projections for hydrogen schemes. And the Qatari government, as I understand, is also considering how it can explore its potential role in the emerging hydrogen economy. And as things stand, there has not been any real joint-up thinking in terms of a regional hydrogen strategy across MENA. It appears that the individual states are developing their own programs. These are in line with our national ambitions that are reflected in both their nationally determined contributions under the terms of the Paris Agreement, and also, and more importantly, in their own domestic visions that set out national targets for sustainability-reduced emissions. So speaking of that, the UAE, we have the Energy Strategy 2050, which was launched in 2017, and this was the first unified energy strategy in that country that is based on supply and demand. And it aims to increase the contribution of clean energy in the energy mix from 25% to 50% by 2050, and also to reduce the carbon footprint of power generation by 70%. And one of the main branches of that strategy is research, development, and innovation to ensure the sustainability of energy. And this has seen the UAE invest in research and development into green hydrogen energy solutions. In Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, which is all about increasing its renewable energy targets from, I think, 27 gigawatts, almost 30 gigawatts within 5 years, almost 60 gigawatts by 2030. And in Oman, similarly, we have Vision 2040, which sets out Oman's ambition to preserve environmental sustainability and produce renewable energy will be a key element in achieving that sustainability. So the government of Oman identified the need to explore renewable energy. And interestingly, in 2015, none of Oman's energy demand was satisfied by renewable sources. And now Oman targets 20% renewable energy consumption by 2030 and almost 40% by 2040. So for the moment, the development of targets and strategies for clean energy across the Gulf is being developed by domestic governments without much of regional cooperation. But I think it is fair to say that some of the leaders of regional governments, they are recognizing the need to collaborate in order to develop the clean energy industry in the whole region and explore the potential opportunities relating to clean energy such as green hydrogen.
That's great, Pawel. Thank you. And you mentioned the Paris Accord and obligations that countries have under that in order to meet clean standards and emissions reductions. Are there other factors that is pushing this forward? I know, of course, over the years, diversification of economies in the Middle East away from oil and gas has always been kind of a talking point. Are there other motivating factors for the countries pursuing hydrogen?
Oh, hi, David. That's an interesting. I think the starting point has to be the Paris Agreement, because under that you have international countries who have set themselves targets to try and keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. So there's going to need to be a transition from away from hydrocarbon energy production. Hydrocarbons are going to have to be replaced with low carbon or carbon-free energy sources. So that leads us to look at blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. Across MENA, there's an abundance of renewable energy, including solar and wind power, which can be used to power green hydrogen production. The availability of low-cost renewable energy, coastlines with existing port infrastructure, an abundance of unpopulated low-cost land and relatively cheap capital in the Middle East means that hydrogen production could be more economical in MENA, potentially than in other parts of the world. The oil and gas producing nations of the Gulf are geographically well positioned, proximity to markets in North America, Asia, and Europe. They already have extensive infrastructure in place, including refineries, storage and bunkering facilities, as well as pipelines. So this existing infrastructure that there already is in the Middle East could be repurposed for hydrogen, meaning that the Gulf states aren't going to have to develop the entire infrastructure for green hydrogen from scratch. Also, in the GCC states, there's a large number of capital-rich state-owned energy companies. So we're looking at companies like Aramco in Saudi Arabia, ADNOC in the UAE, Qatar Petroleum, Qatar Gas, and the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. And these companies already have significant expertise and skills and infrastructure and logistics in terms of working in energy. And so what we think is that those skills are transferable, so they can quite easily shift into the green energy space. So I think that's quite an important motivational factor in for the regional governments in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that the other motivational factor for these countries looking to develop hydrogen at scale would be that they are looking at a pretty simple equation. So they have capital, and that capital is at the moment generated by the fact that the region is rich in fossil fuels and hydrocarbons. And we are now looking at a situation where global hydrocarbon demand will substantially reduce over the next 10 to 20 years, which will have the effect on valuing those hydrocarbon reserves and obviously undermining the economic and industrial basis of the regional economy. So with that capital that they can generate through exploitation of fossils, they are now looking to invest in clean energy products, which will ensure that they remain relevant players in the global energy industry. And I'm convinced that the emerging hydrogen economy will be a crucial component of the decarbonization of the world's energy demands, including in this region.
That was a really helpful answer. And I think the discussion about production of green hydrogen, electrolytic hydrogen from renewable sources is important. And also, the fact that the existing natural gas resource base is so significant in the Middle East and Pawel, especially in Doha, where you sit. I'm curious, and you also talked about the existing infrastructure that the countries have. I'm curious, as you look at potential trading partners for the Middle East countries, you think about the markets that they're going to be serving or potentially looking to serve. Does it look the same as their historical profile of being, the world's supplier of oil and the world's supplier of natural gas? Or do the trading patterns, do the kind of trading partners begin to look a little bit different? And the reason I ask that is because, hydrogen is the most abundant element, right? So to the extent that the United States, which historically imported, massive volumes of oil and previously natural gas from the Middle East, if the United States is advancing its own hydrogen goals and producing its own hydrogen, how does that change how the Middle East will think about where it's sending its production if it advances these plans?
I think it's still Europe and Asia that will be key demand centers for clean energy and possibly for hydrogen import from the region. I think Asia, Europe, probably North America as well. As a matter of fact, the world's first delivery of blue ammonia was shipped from Saudi to Japan in 2020. And this is indicative of the potential markets that will exist for clean energy, and both Japan and Korea will be considered as important clean energy markets. I think for Qatar, Japan and Korea are the biggest importers and clients of the other, so I don't think that will change. Europe must also be considered as a key demand center for clean energy. I think European production would still not be sufficient to decarbonize hard-to-abate industries in the short term, or for European nations to achieve their emissions targets under the Paris Agreement. What is also interesting here is that the clean fuels, such as hydrogen, are expected to displace, fossil fuels to a large extent. So I think around 10 billion barrels of oil will be replaced or equivalent by 2050. So that's almost 40% of global oil production. So interestingly, this is a bit of a double-edged sword for the oil and gas producing states of MENA. So on the one hand, they, as European states, strive to reduce carbon emissions. We can expect that would mean that their demand for oil and gas will decrease. And much of that oil and gas, as you mentioned, is supplied from the East. And on the other hand, there will be a growing demand for clean energy, which the Gulf states might be well placed to supply.
Yeah, I think that's important to discuss the international markets that they might look to serve, that the Middle Eastern countries might look to serve. But I think it's also really important to consider whether the regional governments will be able to develop domestic markets for hydrogen consumption. And this is important to bear in mind, because one of the prohibitive issues with the use of hydrogen at the moment is a lack of infrastructure and the subsequent cost of hydrogen production. So with the additional cost of having to store it, potentially converting the products, for example, from hydrogen to ammonia, and then transporting that product, it really adds up. And this obviously reduces the profitability of hydrogen production. So I think it seems that regional MENA governments will need to develop a regional demand for clean energy, meaning that hydrogen that is produced in the Gulf is actually used in the Gulf. And this could be a crucial step to allowing the development of hydrogen production facilities, which will also allow them then to be expanded, bringing down the cost of hydrogen production and to allow a scaling up of production facilities. And only once those production facilities are really scaled up might we expect to see affordable hydrogen that can then be supplied internationally.
Thank you both. That was a really helpful answer, and interesting to hear you talk about a regional approach. Sholto, our listeners may have just listened to our last episode of Hydrogen Rising, where we talked with Connected DMV, which is a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that is looking at a regional approach to hydrogen here in the U.S. And really interesting to hear that developing in other parts of the world as well, as we look towards a hydrogen economy at scale, potentially on a global level. I want to shift gears a little bit. We have talked about some of the commercial and physical infrastructure challenges that a hydrogen economy at scale may face, but with 4 lawyers on the phone, we would be remiss not to touch on some of the legal and regulatory issues here too. In prior episodes, we've talked about some of the existing legal and regulatory frameworks in a number of different countries. Some countries have legal principles and regulations on the books already that deal with hydrogen, and the question has been whether those are sufficient. Others are really at a more nascent stage with respect to legal and regulatory frameworks. So I'd be curious whether there are existing legal and regulatory frameworks within or across the MENA countries for hydrogen, and if there aren't, or if those regulations might need to be expanded a bit, whether there is an advantage to implementing frameworks like that.
That's a very important question, and I think the fact of the matter is that it's got a very simple answer in the Middle East. And the answer to it is no. There is basically no legal or regulatory framework regarding hydrogen at the moment. That's in terms of production, utilization, trade, storage. So they might be able to use some existing regulations in terms of what they have for energy production, in terms of oil and gas, really, and how that might apply to hydrogen as a clean energy. But there aren't actually yet really specific laws that have been established to deal with hydrogen. And if you compare that to countries like Australia or the United States, they already have really well established and extensive regulatory frameworks regarding clean energy production. So they are steps ahead in terms of the legal framework that you do need to develop these industries. I would say that as of now, as of 2021, there's not really an overarching strategy for the development of hydrogen across the Middle East. And Pawel touched on this earlier. Because there's no overarching strategy, there's also no hydrogen-related legislation that's come about as yet. Limited regulation of hydrogen in countries such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, I think is indicative of the fact that the development of hydrogen projects does remain at a very early stage. You know, most of the projects that we see here are pilot projects. So you probably expect the legislation to start catching up with the pilot projects quite soon.
Yeah, and at the same time, you know, there's no question that in order to maintain and develop economic growth, those regional governments, they need to establish a strategic policy roadmap coupled with an appropriate legal and regulatory framework to facilitate the emergence of those states, particularly GCC states, as leaders in the emerging hydrogen economy. I think it will be a crucial step. Developing regulatory framework will be a crucial step if the GCC is to attract the fiscal and technological investment that will be essential components to the development of the hydrogen industry in this region. So we're talking downstream regulations, for example, regarding the manufacture of fuel cell cars, trucks, buses, that we have partly seen in UAE already happening, but also a supportive regulatory environment must be established, including a regulatory regime that would incentivize green hydrogen projects, for example, by introducing emission schemes and providing financial support mechanisms. And I think that, you know, such regulation and legislation would help to develop a meaningful framework around which that hydrogen infrastructure and marketplaces can be further developed, and it will also give investors and funders the certainty and confidence that they need in order to invest in hydrogen projects in the region. So that all, you know, should allow development of the market both up and down the production chain.
Great, thank you. I guess in addition to talking about overarching and broader legal and regulatory frameworks, we also should talk a little bit about the development of technical regulations. And we've seen this start in different countries around the world. I know we talk a little bit about this in the MENA chapter of the handbook, but can you share some information for our listeners on the ESMA draft technical regulations?
Yeah, it's a good question because we have seen a set of regulations come out in regard to hydrogen-powered vehicles in the UAE. Hydrogen-powered vehicles are environmentally friendly because the only byproduct is water vapor, i.e. steam. You know, there's no carbon dioxide whatsoever. So one of the potential applications for hydrogen that is being looked into at the moment is really transportation. So looking at haulage vehicles in particular. So this is an important area of research and development in the hydrogen space. As part of Dubai's Expo 2020, which has obviously been postponed due to COVID, Dubai Electricity and Water Authority are launching a pilot green hydrogen mobility project. And so what they're trying to do is produce green hydrogen locally and then take that green hydrogen to power a fleet of hydrogen cell vehicles that will be operational during Expo 2020. Now, hand in hand with that pilot scheme, we've seen the Emirates Authority for Standardization and Metrology establish the first set of regulations regarding vehicles that use hydrogen fuel cells. These regulations set the legal standards for hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So the development of these regulations are obviously timed to complement the rollout of the hydrogen cell vehicles in the UAE for Expo 2020. I think it's quite important to note that the UAE is the first country in MENA that's developed these technical regulations for hydrogen-powered vehicles. And I think that goes some way to demonstrate that the UAE is taking a lead regionally in terms of establishing, or its intention to establish, a regulatory framework in terms of clean energy.
Sholto, your comment there about the hydrogen mobility project kind of gives surprise to me, something that I've been wanting to ask you guys about, and in particular, just reading the news as we are and hearing about projects that come up that I have been watching for even before, I would say, Sandi and I were working deeply on hydrogen issues, have been following the proposed NEOM Saudi Arabia city in the northwest of the country. It is a fascinating proposal to really build what some would call a futuristic city. I think the M of the name NEOM actually is kind of an abbreviation for Mustaqbal in Arabic, which means the future. And it seems almost unbelievable when you kind of read what the plans are. And I know kind of incorporating into NEOM Saudi Arabia is what will be the world's largest green hydrogen production plant. I'm wondering if you can talk about either NEOM a bit or other projects of kind of similar scale or similar importance that you guys are following.
Yeah, this is one of those projects which is definitely a standout, and we're looking closely at it since, if delivered, it would make it, as you say, one of the biggest and one of the first green hydrogen ammonia export projects of the scale. So this project is developed since July 2020, and this is between Saudi Arabia's utility developer Aqua Power and NEOM, where they signed an agreement with US-based airports. It's $5 billion hydrogen-based ammonia production facility powered by renewable energy, and it will be jointly owned by all three partners. It will be based in this futuristic city of NEOM and will be a part of Saudi Arabia's 500 billion giga project of NEOM. I think there is the plan to include 20 megawatts electrolyzers plant as a part of that Helios development. And that electrolyzer plant will produce hydrogen from solar and wind. That plant will be supplied by Germany's ThyssenKrupp, and the Saudi and German governments, they have been collaborating on that project for some time now. And interestingly, the German government confirmed that it would contribute around the equivalent of almost $2 million to the planned hydrogen electrolyzers plant. And once commissioned, the facility intends to integrate 4 gigawatts of renewable solar and wind power and produce up to 650 tons of green hydrogen per day, which is amazing. And then also it will produce 1.2 million tons of green ammonia per year, which obviously can be exported around the world and to be used to produce green hydrogen for the transport market. So definitely a great pathfinder to watch.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia having a $500 billion project is, which I think this NEOM project covers about the size of Belgium. These sorts of projects are pretty hard to replicate, but there are other really interesting things that are being developed over in the Middle East. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the Doha port development, which is happening in Oman, where they're basically aiming to develop the port as a green hydrogen hub. And we're seeing an increase in interest in various port operators and port authorities in the region, where they can start using this existing port infrastructure for hydrogen or ammonia shipment. So in Oman, there are plans at the Sohar port and free zone to become the country's first green hydrogen hub, where they'll be using low-cost solar power to produce carbon-free green hydrogen. And then this will help to fuel clean vehicles and reduce on-site emissions. So they actually want to use the clean energy locally, actually on site. The Sohar Port and Free Zone is an operation that's managed together as a joint venture between the Port of Rotterdam and the Sultanate of Oman. So you can see there is some sort of linked up thinking between Europe and the Middle East on this. And Sohar is working in collaboration with the Port of Rotterdam, as well as Hydrogen Rise and other international research institutions. And what they're looking for is how to identify cost-effective solutions for the utilization of hydrogen, really as an alternative to natural gas. One of the things they're intending to build in the Sohar project is electrolyzers at the port to produce that low-cost supply of green hydrogen. And also there you have very high average wind speeds. So they're not only solar-rich, they're also wind-rich in terms of renewable energy sources. And then also they'll be exploring how they can use that hydrogen to power seagoing vessels. So they're actually looking now at, whether or not the shipping itself can be powered by a clean energy rather than having huge diesel engines and shit. So there is some really interesting thinking happening, I think, in Oman at the moment.
the scale is interesting, as you note, and not replicable in most places around the world. And, I think also not lost is the power of the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East countries and their ability to execute financially on projects like this. So really, really interesting. Appreciate that. I'm going to continue to watch the NEOM project.
I think we're pretty close to our time, but have time probably for one last question. I guess with all of the developments that we've talked about today, as we think about moving from where we stand today to a fully realized hydrogen economy in MENA, what are some of the steps and maybe just the first couple steps along the way that we're going to need to take to get to that future?
Thanks, Sandi. Let me just mention too, and one of them I think I've already touched upon, which is legislation and regulation. So definitely it is important for governments to establish specific hydrogen-focused legislation and develop regulatory framework. And they should also create a supportive or incentivizing schemes, for example, by introducing emission schemes or providing financial support. And this would also be important in attracting investors and funders and increase their confidence in this marketplace. And the second thing I wanted to mention, because I'm a PPP lawyer, is that to be an alignment between governments and private sector companies with requisite knowledge, experience, capabilities, so that these PPP relationships needs to be developed, I think. And both the public and private sectors need to be a sensible approach to ensuring appropriate financing, construction, and operational structures can be formulated. So to make hydrogen market appealing for investment. And truth to be told, the existing relationships and structures which exist in the MENA PPP sector, especially in power and water, they can be utilized in the development of green hydrogen plants. So that doesn't need to be done from scratch. Sholto?
I mean, I think you've covered off like the main points. I think they need that legislation and regulation, like you say, and with that will bring confidence to the investor market. And with that investment, that then needs to be really used for the development of infrastructure, because until the infrastructure is in place, the cost of production of hydrogen is just too high. And, the production facilities need to be pretty scaled up to bring those costs down. So I think having an environment where confidence of investors is high is really important. And David, you touched on the sovereign wealth funds before, and I think it's really important that those sovereign wealth funds are starting to think about how they can invest in that infrastructure regionally as well. That would be the key takeaway for me, is the investment into actual hydrogen production and storage and transportation infrastructure.
Just to finish this off, I think hydrogen production would also benefit from prioritized in the region's state-owned oil and gas companies. So they shouldn't necessarily see hydrogen as a competitor, energy production mix. So I'm thinking about companies such as ADNOC, Qatar Petroleum, or Saudi Aramco. And these energy giants will undoubtedly be able to utilize and adapt their traditional hydrocarbon industrial models to green hydrogen, as they already have the infrastructure, expertise and capital, financial means, which are all necessary to develop hydrogen technology and infrastructure.
Great. Thank you both so much for the conversation today and for taking the time to join us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time as well.
Thank you so much, Sandi and David. It was a pleasure. Great speaking to you.
And thank you also to our listeners for joining us today. Please check out the Hydrogen Handbook. It's a free resource available at klgates.com/hydrogen. The handbook covers legal, regulatory, commercial, and policy issues that we think the hydrogen industry will face as it moves towards scale. And it includes chapters on Australia, the EU, Germany, France, Japan, Singapore, the United Kingdom, the United States, and a chapter on MENA, which, if you're looking for more information on the topics that we talked about today, that would be a great place to start. If you have questions about any of the issues that we discussed today, please don't hesitate to reach out, and stay tuned for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising coming your way in 2 weeks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes, and check out our market-leading publication, the Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.